What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Welcome to another day in which international politics, for better or worse, refuses to rest. Two big developments stand out as of today. First, Norway decides to boost its financial commitment to Ukraine. It more than doubles it, to be precise, while also strengthening its own military. And second, a phone call between President Donald Trump and Russian President, who else but Vladimir Putin, yields a promise to scale back attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine for at least 30 days.
Are currently speaking on the phone about ending the war in Ukraine after President Trump's statement that, quote, many elements of a deal to end the conflict have been agreed to.
As long as both sides, or at least one of them, follows through on this promise and actually stops sending drones and missiles. Some call that progress, while others sense a carefully calculated half measure. The biggest concern, as expected, is that Putin will use this time to stockpile the weapons, and as soon as temporary ceasefire is over, or maybe or even most likely earlier, use all that accumulated aerial devices to launch a huge devastating attack against Ukraine. So today, guys, let's talk about both those things. Try to figure out whether a ceasefire, even temporary, is whether it is a good thing or not, and what are the potential consequences of broken promises. Norway, known for calm policies and a sovereign wealth fund that hovers around an incredible $1.8 trillion, has suddenly grabbed the international spotlight. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent energy prices soaring, Norway's gas revenues surged dramatically.
Up 56% in a year, gasoline now averaging $3.51 nationally, up from $2.63 a year ago.
That windfall drew attention at home and abroad, with many voices urging Oslo, the capital of Norway, to share its wealth with Kyiv, a country ravaged by war. Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, no stranger to moral and political dilemmas, responded by announcing a huge increase in aid from the previously planned 35 billion crowns to a formidable 85 billion, approximately roughly $7.8 billion. It is a massive increase, more than a double to be specific, which he justifies by warning of the worst security threat for Norway since the Second World War. A pointed reminder that no European nation, however distant from fighting, can afford to be complacent. On the domestic front, some observers note that this move might have come sooner, especially since neighboring countries like Denmark and Sweden have given substantial support to Ukraine relative to their own GDP. Others argue that Norway's leaders had been cautious, wanting to ensure the public understood the gravity of what was at stake before making a colossal financial commitment. And meanwhile, Store's government emphasizes that such aid packages are not just about money, but about sending an unmistakable message that aggression will not go unchecked, even if it unfolds hundreds of miles away. In a country where large-scale conflict once felt like a relic of the past, the rhetoric of a looming threat still resonates deeply with the population. Norway's conservative opposition, in a rare show of unity, backs Store's plan and may even support further increases if the situation demands it. This sudden generosity also reflects the moral dimension of Norway's oil and gas profits. While revenues soared, the contrast were Ukraine, where towns are destroyed and civilians endure hardships. This contrast became increasingly obvious. In effect, Norway is putting part of its windfall toward a cause it sees as central to European stability. Some Norwegians still worry about the potential blowback if the conflict escalates or drags on, but for now, there is a sense that stepping up is both a duty and a smart diplomatic move. After all, a richer Norway doing relatively little would look a little inappropriate on the global stage, especially with images of war-torn Ukrainian cities circulating around the internet. And sure, these contributions are purely volunteer, but there is no denying the fact that some politicians, including Norwegian ones, might exploit the lack of support by Norway to their own advantage, bringing dirt to the country's reputation. Although Norway is not in the European Union, it is firmly rooted in NATO, making it an indispensable partner in the continent's defense matrix. Not long ago, European leaders met in Brussels with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, renewing calls for unity and ramped up assistance. Cameras flashed, statements flew, and politicians lined up to signal their unwavering commitment. But beneath these public demonstrations, though, simmer serious questions of capacity and endurance. Economic challenges loom large, from inflation to unpredictable energy costs. Many voters across Europe are aware of the financial toll, and some governments face intense domestic debates about how long they can sustain massive aid flows. For Norway, these concerns are less acute. With the sovereign fund bursting at the seams, Oslo avoids the arguments over deficits that troubles much of the European Union. Because as a sole country, Norway can make such decisions on its own, not requiring the approval of other member states. That autonomy speeds up decision-making and lets a Stoa act decisively without dreading fiscal collapse or voter revolt. Although scrutiny still comes from those who feel local priorities might be overshadowed. Infrastructure improvements, healthcare expansion, and educational reforms matter to everyday Norwegians, obviously. And some resent large sums going abroad. Unfortunately, it's quite understandable. Yet in a region witnessing Russia's pushback on Western influence, the strategic rationale for heavy support to Ukraine can carry more weight than purely domestic concerns. If a militaristic power succeeds in rewriting borders by force, no country on Europe's perimeter can ever feel fully secure ever again. Meanwhile, Stoa has floated proposals to bolster Norway's own defense capabilities, signaling that Oslo grasps the potential consequential risks. Military strategists remain alert to Russia's capacity for surprise, recalling episodes of strategic bomber flights that penetrated European airspace. A robust Norwegian defense stands to reinforce NATO's northern flank, a critical stretch that extends deep into the Arctic. In simple terms, the notion of better safe than sorry resonates here, very much so. If the conflict in Ukraine has taught Europe one lesson, it is that wars once deemed unlikely can erupt and expand rapidly, unexpectedly, destroying all the assumptions about alleged stability. No matter how many billions funneled into Ukraine, long-term peace, as well as temporary ceasefire proposals, will include the involvement of decisions made inside Moscow as well. To end a war is a very complicated thing to do, much harder than starting one, because you need to make two countries that literally hate each other to shake hands and agree to become friends once again, or at least to become neutral. This might be already complicated enough if you have rational people on both sides, but when you add egomaniacs, power-obsessed, stubborn people into the equation, well, as expected, the resolution becomes nearly impossible. But still things have to be done. First steps should always be prepared, no matter what. That's why recently we had the phone call between Trump and Putin, which reportedly lasted 2 to 3 hours.
The Kremlin has confirmed that the two leaders agreed to pursue a ceasefire on energy and infrastructure targets. Under that proposal, both Russia and Ukraine would stop hitting each other's energy infrastructure for 30 days. The US says the next step will be technical negotiations to implement a ceasefire in the Black Sea and work towards a permanent peace.
According to the White House, Russia has agreed to halt strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. Later, reportedly, Zelensky agreed to that proposal, at least according to the information available at the moment of recording this video. For Kyiv, though, this falls short of the comprehensive truce it has promoted. Even if the power grid gets a temporary relief, the rest of the battlefield remains active, meaning the possibility of continued shelling and civilian casualties elsewhere still increases. In Washington, officials are spinning this partial measure as progress. The Kremlin, meanwhile, claims Putin immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order to cease all the attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, implying swift compliance on the ground. Basically saying, hey Trump, look at me, I said I will do it and, well, I'm doing it. Kinda. Partial truces can serve as a breathing space for repositioning forces, especially when they are narrowly positioned. If shelling continues near frontline towns or in contested territories, the respite for energy facilities will not solve the deeper crisis. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has framed this 30-day pause as a test.
Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation.
If the Kremlin fails to uphold even such a limited agreement, hopes for broader negotiations all but vanish. And if Putin does honor the deal, more concessions like a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea may follow, though nobody's holding their breath. Another problem is that Putin will most likely use this time to restock missiles and drones, and then, either through an actual Ukrainian attack, maybe an accidental, or provocation from the Russian side, the regime of Putin will unleash hundreds of these munitions as a retaliatory strike, justifying its actions in front of the White House as necessary to protect the interests of Russia. This will be a perfect excuse to complain to Trump that, look, told you, Ukrainians will break this promise, you can never trust Zelensky. That's why we have to finish what we have started. This idea increases the probability that in case Ukraine actually respects the ceasefire, it will be Russians themselves, closer to the end of the ceasefire timeline, attacking their own positions, making it look like it was Ukrainians. Complicating matters is the ongoing discussion about territorial integrity. Russia has seized chunks of Ukrainian land and exerts control over the strategic Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Not to mention, Moscow demands absolute guarantees that Ukraine will never join alliances such as NATO. Throw in a pending prisoner swap, 175 Russians in exchange for 175 Ukrainians, and the diplomatic tapestry grows even more intricate. While such exchanges might momentarily ease tensions, they do not address the war's root causes. The partial ceasefire, then, could be another maneuver in a long game, buying Russia time to consolidate positions or wait out Western impatience. Each day the conflict continues, calls might grow in Europe for negotiated end, even if that means Ukraine compromises on core national interests. According to Putin, central to any lasting peace is whether Ukraine gives up some of its sovereign lands. Here President Trump appears more willing to critique Zelensky than it is to blame Putin, a stance that puzzles obviously many analysts. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz suggested that Ukraine might have to accept territorial losses in exchange for tangible security promises from the West.
Some type of territorial concession for security guarantees going forward.
From Kyiv's perspective, that borders literally on capitulation, obviously. Having rallied citizens with vows to liberate every inch of occupied territory, Zelensky cannot easily shift course without risking a severe backlash from both political allies and the general Ukrainian public. Trump, for his part, seems to view territorial compromise as a pragmatic path to a quick resolution, especially if the fighting can be paused under terms that let him claim a diplomatic triumph. He frequently refers to the significance of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, a massive nuclear facility that Russia controls. Should Ukraine agree to let Moscow keep that price, the conflict's power dynamics would change irreversibly, granting Russia a strategic foothold deep within Ukraine. Additionally, Putin wants to tie any ceasefire agreement to curbing US military assistance, effectively limiting Kyiv's ability to defend itself in the future. Zelensky, however, knows that without security guarantees, stepping back now could pave the way for renewed aggression later. Back in Washington, official statements convey optimism. People talk of normalized ties with Moscow if a settlement holds. Across Europe, skepticism runs high. Leaders recall earlier broken assurances and see an obvious mismatch in how Trump pressures a sieged ally while submitting to demands of the old familiar counterpart. With media attention fixated on each new twist, the pressure on Zelensky to find a deal intensifies. Yet, he remains aware of handing Moscow a permanent advantage. Meanwhile, time is not necessarily unfortunately on Ukraine's side. War fatigue, coupled with potential shifts in the US leadership or European politics, could weaken resolve to keep funding Kyiv at current levels. If partial ceasefires reduce the conflict's visibility, the urgency to supply arms and money might fade, allowing Russia to dictate terms at the negotiating table. Well, there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe